January 10th, 1475. 80,000 Ottoman soldiers marched into a narrow valley, confident they would crush a small principality in hours. By sunset, 40,000 of them were dead. The survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain how 20,000 men, using nothing but fog and frozen rivers, had turned their empire's greatest invasion into its most humiliating massacre. This is the story of the Battle of Vaslui, where terrain became a weapon, where weather killed more men than swords, and where a small nation proved that intelligence defeats numbers. But before we begin, if you're fascinated by the darkest moments in military history, hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into battles history forgot, strategies that shouldn't have worked, and the moments where everything went catastrophically wrong. Moldavia was not supposed to survive the 15th century. Squeezed between three predators: the Ottoman Empire to the south, the Kingdom of Hungary to the west, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the north. A buffer state, a speed bump, a territory that existed only because bigger powers hadn't yet decided who would swallow it. Its ruler, Stephen III, understood this perfectly. He had watched neighboring principalities try appeasement. Wallachia paid tribute and lost half its territory anyway. Serbia negotiated treaties and was absorbed entirely. Bulgaria didn't even get the chance to surrender before it disappeared from the map. Stephen studied these failures the way a man studies the bodies of those who walked into quicksand before him. He learned one lesson above all others. Empires do not negotiate with prey. They devour it. Slowly or quickly, but they always devour it. So when the Ottoman demands grew heavier, when the tribute became unbearable, when Sultan Mehmed II sent messages that were less requests and more ultimatums, Stephen made a decision that most considered suicidal. He stopped paying. The response was immediate. The Sultan assembled an army under Haddam Suleiman Pasha, one of his most experienced commanders. The orders were clear: crush Moldavia completely. Make an example so brutal that no other principality would dare defy the empire again. 80,000 soldiers began their march north in the dead of winter. And Stephen began preparing the most elaborate ambush in medieval warfare. While the Ottoman army assembled, Moldavia emptied. Not in panic, not in chaos, with cold, methodical precision. Villages along the southern frontier evacuated. Women, children, elderly moved north into the hills. But they didn't just flee. They destroyed everything useful behind them. Wells were poisoned. Grain stores burned. Bridges collapsed. Roads that had existed for centuries disappeared overnight, filled with fallen trees and boulder traps hidden under fresh snow. The Moldavians were erasing their own country, turning it into a ghost land where an invading army would find nothing to eat, nowhere to sleep, no intelligence to gather. Stephen's scouts mapped every inch of terrain the Ottomans would cross. They noted where the ice was thick enough to hold cavalry and where it would crack under weight. They measured how long fog lingered in each valley at dawn. They tested how sound carried across frozen riverbeds. The Ottomans were marching into what they thought was enemy territory. They were actually marching into a laboratory of calculated death. Stephen divided his 20,000 men into specialized units. Light cavalry, trained to strike from unexpected angles and vanish before counterattacks could form. Archers who practiced firing blind into fog, using sound and timing instead of sight. Elite infantry who would deliver the killing blow once the enemy was already broken. Even the peasant levies, men with no formal training, were given crucial roles. They knew these forests better than any Ottoman scout ever could. They understood which paths led to safety and which led to frozen marshes that looked solid until you stepped on them. But the most important preparation was psychological. Stephen sent small raiding parties to harass Ottoman supply lines. Quick strikes that accomplished little militarily but created a specific impression. The impression of a desperate, disorganized enemy. an army too weak to stand and fight. The Ottomans saw these raids and grew more confident. They believed Moldavia was collapsing before they even arrived, that the war would be over in days. And while they grew confident, Stephen selected the killing ground, a valley near the town of Vaslui, narrow enough to compress a large army into a confined space, surrounded by ridges where thousands of men could hide, cut by a river that froze unevenly, creating death traps disguised as escape routes. By early January, everything was in position. Hidden trenches covered with snow, cannons mounted on sleds that could be moved silently through forests, archers stationed on high ground with clear lines of fire into the valley below. And on January 9th, the scouts brought the news Stephen had been waiting for. The Ottoman army had entered Moldavian territory. They were marching directly toward Vaslui, confident, disciplined, and completely unaware they were walking into the most lethal trap in medieval history. Stephen gathered his commanders that night. No speeches, no grand declarations, just cold, simple instructions. Tomorrow morning the fog will be thick. When it lifts, we will have already won, or we will all be dead. There is no third option. Before we see how this trap springs, I want to hear from you. If you were commanding the Ottoman army and realized you were being ambushed in dense fog, what would you do? Try to retreat? Push forward? Form a defensive circle? Drop your answer in the comments. Let's see who thinks like a medieval commander. Because what's about to happen is something no Ottoman general had ever experienced before. January 10th, hours before dawn. The valley near Vaslui filled with fog so thick you couldn't see your own hand at arm's length. It rolled in from the east like something alive, swallowing the landscape in white silence. The kind of fog that deadens sound, that turns familiar terrain alien, that makes armies blind. Stephen's men were already in position. They had moved into place during the night, guided by scouts who knew every rock and tree. Now they waited, invisible shapes crouched in the snow along the ridges. 20,000 men holding their breath. Below them, the Ottoman vanguard entered the valley. You could hear them before you could see them. The grinding of wagon wheels, the jingle of cavalry harnesses, voices calling out in Turkish and Arabic, trying to maintain formation in the blinding white. 80,000 soldiers funneling into a space barely wide enough for a fraction of that number. Hadan Suleiman Pasha rode near the front of the column, an experienced commander who had fought in a dozen campaigns. He had expected resistance at the border, guerrilla attacks in the forests, perhaps a desperate last stand near the Moldavian capital. He had not expected silence. The deeper they moved into the valley, the more uneasy his scouts became. No enemy sightings, no defensive positions, just empty land and this suffocating fog that refused to lift. Some officers urged caution, suggested halting until visibility improved. But momentum is a hard thing to stop when you're commanding 80,000 men stretched across miles of frozen terrain. The army kept moving forward, and on the ridges above, Stephen raised his hand, then dropped it. The fog exploded with sound. Not the sound of men screaming, that came later. First, it was the sound of arrows. Thousands of them launched from positions the Ottomans couldn't see, fired by archers who had trained for this exact moment. The arrows fell like rain made of iron. The Ottoman vanguard reacted with disciplined speed, shields raised, formations tightening. But they were reacting to an enemy they couldn't locate. The fog hid everything. The arrows seemed to come from every direction at once. More volleys followed, Rapid, precise, devastating. Moldavian archers had practiced firing on timers, not on sight. They knew the valley's dimensions, knew where the Ottoman columns would be compressed. They didn't need to see. They just needed to aim at the space where thousands of men were trapped together. Hatem Süleyman Pasha shouted for his archers to return fire. But return fire where? At what target? His men loosed arrows into empty fog, while Moldavian volleys continued to tear through his ranks with brutal accuracy. Then the cannons opened up. Small, mobile cannons that Stephen had positioned on sleds behind the ridges. They fired into the densest parts of the Ottoman column, then crews dragged them to new positions before the enemy could locate them. The sound was catastrophic. In the fog, it seemed like the entire valley was exploding. Ottoman soldiers couldn't tell if they were facing 10 cannons or 100. The muzzle flashes appeared like lightning from random directions. Panic began to spread. Units broke formation, trying to escape fire they couldn't see. Officers lost control of their men. The disciplined Ottoman advance dissolved into confusion within minutes. And Stephen hadn't even committed his cavalry yet. They came from the flanks, light cavalry units bursting out of the white blindness like apparitions. Moldavian riders who knew this terrain with their eyes closed. They struck the Ottoman columns at their weakest points, the gaps that had formed when units scattered under arrow fire. Sabers flashing, lances driving through armor, then vanishing back into the fog before counterattacks could form. The Ottomans swung at shadows. By the time they turned to face an attack, the Moldavians were already gone. Then another unit would hit from a completely different direction, then another, then two at once. It was warfare designed to destroy not just bodies, but minds. The Ottoman soldiers couldn't process what was happening, couldn't see the battlefield, couldn't distinguish friend from foe in the white chaos. Some units fired on their own men by mistake. Others retreated directly into traps Stephen had prepared, hidden ditches covered with snow that swallowed horses and riders whole. Hatem Süleyman Pasha tried desperately to reform his lines. He was a good commander facing an impossible situation. His army outnumbered the enemy 4-1, but numbers meant nothing when you couldn't see the enemy or coordinate your own forces. He ordered a retreat to regroup outside the valley. A sound tactical decision, but it was already too late. Because Stephen had positioned forces behind them as well. Units that had circled through the forests during the night, cutting off escape routes. The Ottomans weren't retreating, they were running directly into another ambush. And that's when Stephen played his final card, the sound that would break an empire's nerve. Moldavian war horns, deep, resonating blasts that echoed through the fog from every direction. One horn, then 10, then dozens, creating the auditory illusion of an army far larger than 20,000. In the blinding fog, surrounded by sounds of death, the Ottomans began to believe they were facing a force that outnumbered them, that they had walked into a trap so massive, so perfectly orchestrated that escape was impossible. Morale shattered. Units that had held formation finally broke. Men dropped weapons and ran blindly into the fog, not knowing if they were running towards safety or into another killing ground. Most ran toward the river. The Prut River cut through the valley, frozen solid by weeks of brutal winter. To desperate Ottoman soldiers, it looked like salvation. A flat escape route away from the arrow storms and phantom cavalry. Thousands rushed toward it. But Stephen's scouts had spent weeks mapping this river. They knew where the ice was thick and where it was dangerously thin. They knew the current ran faster in certain spots, preventing ice from forming properly. And Moldavian archers knew exactly where to aim. The first men across made it safely, their weight distributed. But as hundreds, then thousands followed, the ice began to web with fractures. Arrows fell not to kill men, but to shatter ice. Each impact weakened the surface a little more. Ottoman soldiers didn't realize what was happening until sections of the river suddenly gave way beneath them. The screams were immediate and short-lived. Water cold enough to stop your heart in minutes. Armor dragging men under before they could even try to swim. The current pulling bodies downstream under intact ice where they would never be found. Those still on the bank watched in horror as the escape route became a mass grave. Some tried to help, reaching out to grab drowning comrades. The ice broke under them too. On the far bank, Moldavian cavalry waited. The few hundred Ottomans who made it across the intact sections found themselves facing fresh enemy troops with nowhere left to run. Back in the valley, the situation was total collapse. Ottoman units were scattered, leaderless, surrounded by an enemy they still couldn't fully see. Some surrendered. Most just ran in any direction that seemed safe. None were safe. Stephen's light infantry, the peasant levies who knew every game trail and hidden path, hunted down fleeing soldiers throughout the day. No dramatic battles, just quick, brutal encounters in the forest. Ottoman soldiers stumbling into Moldavian positions, brief struggles, silence. By midday, the fog finally began to lift. What it revealed was carnage on a scale rarely seen in medieval warfare. The valley floor was carpeted with bodies. Ottoman banners lay trampled in blood-soaked snow. Artillery pieces abandoned. Supply wagons overturned and burning. Of the 80,000 Ottoman soldiers who entered the valley, perhaps 40,000 would make it out of Moldavian territory alive. Thousands more were captured. The rest remained in the valley, in the forest, under the ice. Stephen rode through the battlefield as the light strengthened. His face showed no triumph, no celebration, just the cold focus of a man who understood what he had done and what it would cost. If this level of tactical brilliance is blowing your mind, hit that like button. It helps more people discover these forgotten battles. And here's something to think about. This wasn't the only time weather decided a war. If you want to see how a storm destroyed the largest invasion fleet in history, share this video and let me know in the comments. We'll cover the Mongol invasions of Japan next. But first, let's see what happened after the slaughter ended. When the last sounds of battle faded, an unnatural quiet settled over the valley. Not peace, something heavier. The silence of a place where thousands of men had just learned what true fear felt like, where an empire's confidence had died in a single morning. Stephen's officers waited for orders to pursue, to chase down the fleeing Ottomans and turn defeat into annihilation. Some commanders would have done exactly that, drunk on victory, eager to extract every drop of revenge. Stephen refused. He understood something most medieval generals didn't. Victory on the battlefield meant nothing if you destroyed your own army celebrating it. His men were exhausted, low on arrows, scattered across miles of forest. Chasing a broken enemy into unfamiliar territory was how winners became victims. He sent small, fast scout units to monitor the retreat routes. Their reports confirmed what he'd hoped. The Ottoman army wasn't retreating. It was fleeing in complete disarray. No formation, no coordination, just thousands of traumatized men stumbling south through the snow. Many without weapons, some without boots, all desperate to put distance between themselves and this cursed valley. They would spread word of what happened here far more effectively than any Moldavian messenger ever could. The Moldavian peasants who had evacuated weeks earlier began returning, moving slowly through the trees, still not quite believing the news. Then they saw their own soldiers, alive, victorious, carrying captured Ottoman banners and leading prisoners. Some villagers wept, Some stood frozen in shock. Others simply collapsed from relief. Their homes still stood. Their children were safe. The empire that should have crushed them had instead been crushed. It didn't seem possible, but the evidence was everywhere. That night, Stephen gathered his inner council in a commandeered farmhouse. The room was cramped, cold, lit by a single fire. These men had just accomplished something historians would debate for centuries, and they looked like they could barely stay awake. Stephen spoke quietly. "What we did today will echo. The Sultan will hear of it, Europe will hear of it, and both will respond in ways we cannot predict. This was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a much longer fight." He was right to be cautious. Defeating an Ottoman army once didn't mean safety. The empire had lost battles before and always returned with larger forces, more determined, more vengeful. But something had changed, something intangible but real. A small principality had looked at an overwhelming enemy and refused to accept inevitable defeat, had fought with intelligence instead of just courage, had turned terrain and weather into weapons as deadly as any sword. And Europe had been watching. Stephen sent messengers riding through the night, not to boast, to warn. Letters carried to the courts of Hungary, Poland, the Holy Roman Empire, all saying the same thing. Moldavia held, but the threat wasn't over. The Ottomans would recover, would regroup. And if Moldavia fell in the next invasion, there would be nothing between the empire and Central Europe. This victory hadn't just saved one small principality, it had bought time for everyone. But time was a resource that ran out quickly. The responses came within weeks, riders returning with messages that ranged from genuine praise to barely concealed surprise that Stephen was still alive. The Pope declared him Athleta Christi, champion of Christ, a title that sounded grand but came with no actual military support. The King of Hungary sent congratulations and promises of future cooperation that were vague enough to mean nothing. Poland offered trade agreements, which was at least practical. But the most important response came from people who never wrote letters. Common soldiers across Europe who heard the story and understood its implications. If Moldavia could do this, maybe resistance wasn't futile. Maybe the Ottoman advance wasn't inevitable. The story spread through barracks, monasteries, merchant halls, growing slightly more mythical with each retelling. Some versions claimed the Moldavians had 100,000 men. Others said Stephen had used sorcery to summon the fog. The truth was more impressive than any myth. 20,000 soldiers with almost no resources had defeated an army 4 times their size through pure intelligence, planning, and an absolute refusal to fight on the enemy's terms. Chronicles written decades later would call it one of the greatest military victories in medieval history. Some historians would compare it to Thermopylae or Agincourt. The strategy Stephen used, the integration of terrain into tactical planning, would be studied in military academies centuries after everyone involved was dust. But in the immediate aftermath, those grand assessments didn't exist yet. There was only a battered army fortifying their positions and a ruler who knew the fight was far from over. While Europe celebrated, Stephen focused on survival. Fortresses repaired, roads cleared, supply depots restocked. His soldiers fed, rested, and trained for the inevitable return. Because the Ottomans would return. Empires don't accept humiliation. They erase it with overwhelming force. And they did try. Multiple invasions in the years that followed. But something had changed. The myth of Ottoman invincibility had cracked. Other territories began resisting with more confidence. Alliances formed that wouldn't have existed before Vaslui. Stephen ruled for another 30 years, fought dozens more battles, won most of them, lost some. The Ottomans never successfully conquered Moldavia during his lifetime, not because they lacked the strength, but because the cost of fighting him had become too high. He became known as Stephen the Great. Not just in Moldavia, but across Europe. A ruler who turned a tiny, poor principality into a force that empires had to respect. But he never forgot what happened in that valley, never romanticized it. He had watched thousands of men die in the fog and the frozen river, most of them young soldiers following orders, dying in a foreign land for reasons they probably didn't fully understand. Victory had been necessary, but necessary things aren't always good things. They're just necessary. Today, the valley near Vaslui is quiet farmland, peaceful, easy to drive through without noticing anything unusual. But if you know the story, if you look at the terrain with educated eyes, you can still see it. The ridges where the archers hid, the river where the ice shattered, the narrow space where 80,000 men were compressed into a killing ground. History has a way of smoothing over violence, turning battlefields into tourist sites, making horror seem distant and abstract. But on January 10, 1475, there was nothing abstract about what happened here. It was cold, brutal, and absolutely real. 20,000 people who refused to surrender, who studied their enemies' weaknesses and their own land's strengths, who bet everything on a single morning. And won. The lesson of Vaslui isn't about glory or heroism. It's about what happens when intelligence meets desperation, when a smaller force uses every advantage available, terrain, weather, psychology, to level an uneven field. It's about the fact that empires can be stopped. Not easily, not often, but it's possible. If you want more stories like this, battles where everything went wrong for the side that should have won, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Next week, we're covering the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, where 3 Roman legions walked into a German forest and never walked out. And if you made it this far, drop a comment telling me which battle you want covered next. Should we go ancient, medieval, modern warfare disasters? You decide. Because history is full of moments where the impossible became real, where 20,000 faced 80,000 and won, where fog, frozen rivers, and refusal to surrender changed the course of empires. This was Vaslui. This was the day an empire learned fear. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.